Okay, so for your twisted, or sorry, not your twisted, your braided rings, this is the braid I'm using. It just has to make sure that it's the right thickness. I'm going to show you how to solder your braid first. You must make your braid and your twist, or sorry, your braid and any twists before you make your center shape piece, your shank. So I've already joined my, right there, that's my solder joint. You can see it right there. That's my solder joint. So make sure that it's joined up the right location, and also make sure that you make your ring size, this twist or your braid, at least a half a size smaller than your shank. And I'll show you that in a second. I have my hard solder over here. You should hard solder this if you can. Medium, do not use easy. This is in copper. The shank must be in silver, but the braid can be in copper if you want, if you're trying to save some cash. So on this one, I have access to this piece of wire right here, and I have access to this one, so I'm going to put solder right on those. I can clean those up, but I'm going to put them in positions that I can clean them up. If I can't clean this solder up, I have a problem. So I can clean up that spot. So I'm going to solder this guy first. Just don't let it flow everywhere. One of the reasons you have to use hard solder for this is because you're going to have more than just a couple solder joints on this ring. You've got to be aware of your solder joints. Okay, so there we go. Now I'm going to put a piece on this side where I can clean it. Got to make sure that solder flows. There it goes, and I need to put one on the inside just to make sure that I have flowed my solder all the way. And you should always draw your solder through anyways. I'm going to start my bench on fire here if I'm not careful. Get that in the view. Now I would normally put this into my third arm, but I can't find it. Okay, so now I've got that solder on there. Solder joints are nice and filled. I have to be able to clean that up. So I'm going to pickle it, make sure that's good. And again, that should be a half a size smaller than your ring. Once you have your braid done, that allows you to create this part. So this is my core, and these are my side bands. All I've done on this is same as your first project. I made a band ring. This should be at least 1 millimeter, 1.2 maximum. I have made wire for these. These should be rolled and drawn to make sure they're square. One side I have sanded and finished, and I finished the outside because once the braid gets into place, I might not be able to finish it. These should be very tight fitting on here. I'm going to solder along this edge. I have to make sure it's nice and tight. And what I want to do on both of these is on the side that I've sanded, I want to take the inside edge off just a little bit. And the reason for that is it'll stop the solder from flowing all over the shank. So while that's my twist is pickling, I'm going to put this on here. Now this square wire, when you're making it, it wants to go and get all wobbly because that's how square wire. So you'll make a jump ring. Put it on a bench block, put 2 bench blocks together. After it's annealed, tap them with a mallet and it'll squeeze, or it'll, so I'm just making sure this is a nice tight fit all the way around there and it's round. Make sure that this is flush, so put it down, push it down all the way. So I'm just holding it and I'm pushing it down. Make sure your side band is flat. So my side band isn't flat. So I'm going to put it on here. I can see it's got a little bit of a wobble. So I'm going to take my other bench block, set it down on top of it, tap it, make sure that it's perfectly flat. It needs to be flat. If it's not flat, it's not going to go together properly on your shank. So the side that I finished goes inwards, just like that. Make sure that it's flush and flat. So I put it on my bench block and I just push it down all the way around. And that's also how I know if it's going to be flat or not. It's okay if it's a little bit shallow, so it's okay if there's a little bit on that edge, but not much. I'm going to have to file that off. So what I don't want to do is file off too much of the top there. So make sure it's flush here. If you're not quite flush, make sure there's more of the inner shank showing. So I'm going to solder this in medium. And I can be fairly generous on this. So I'm going to take a few pieces of solder. I'm not going to clean this side up until after I've assembled the whole thing. And the reason for that is it'll let me make sure that my solder joints are good. If I have my piece flow, if I have the bottom flow for whatever reasons, so I set it up like this. I'm going to flux the joint all the way around. Do not line up your solder joints on the inside shank and your side bands. It increases the chances of having something come apart. Later, you won't do this fabricating. So I'm going to heat the whole thing up, focusing on the body of the ring because the side bands are so much smaller. My joint is over here. I'm going to keep that away from the torch so I don't loosen it off. If I wanted to be safe, I could put a pair of tweezers on it right there, but I don't like the heat sink. So I'm going to start away from the joint. Get another one ready to go. You can see how I'm heating the shank as I'm picking up my solder. So I'm heating it along the length of the joint, focusing the torch more on the inside because that's the larger piece of metal. There it goes, the solder just flowed there, so I'm going to move over, make sure that it goes from one solder joint to the next, and then I'm going to put another one here, and I'm going to flood this side with solder. If that's not enough, I'm going to add some more. Make sure it's well soldered. The tighter that joint, the less solder. And that's also why I need to make sure that I draw my square wire through the draw plate. Don't just roll it out. When you roll it out, you get that edge, little curved corner on the wire, and that's going to cause problems. So make sure that this is well flowed. There's no spots that don't have solder in it. I'm going to file this edge off. If this is a tight fit, this should just go on nicely like that. So I'm going to let that sit, cool off, and in the meantime, I'm going to get my braid out of the pickle, clean it on. Make sure your braid, again, is a half size smaller. I'm going to clean it up. Now with these, you can only clean them up as much as you can. It is actually better to do a silver braid because I can clean it up better when it's silver. You don't notice the joint as much. So to clean this up, I'm going to use my rubber wheel. You should have your mask on when you're using this. Clean it up as much as you can. Make sure. So I don't care about the inside. I'm actually going to leave the inside. You can see all that solder in there. I'm not going to see it, so I don't really care about it. Not very happy with my solder joint, but for copper it's good enough. Now, I want to make sure these two sides are parallel. I'm actually going to pickle this now. Make sure these two sides are parallel. To do that, I put this back on there. Put my bench peg back on it. Tap it. I could measure it. It pulls all of this in nicely. You're obviously going to pickle your shank enough. I'm not going to do all the soldering. I need this video to be short. So I'm going to pull my shank out of the pickle, even though it's not done pickling yet. My pickle's actually not warm because I just got in here, but so here we go. I got this big goober on here. I don't care. I'm going to be cutting it off anyways. So this does not fit on here. That's perfect. I want it to be a tight fit. So I'm putting it on my mandrel and I'm just going to stretch it up with my hands. Make sure you flip it around. This will tighten your braid a little bit as well. So if your braid's not quite as tight as mine, it'll allow this to slip on nice and tight like that. Then, make sure it's all the way down, no gap, or at least an even gap. Then, if I don't want this to be a spinner ring, which you do not want with twists and braids, these should not be spinners, they wear out. You put a little bit of medium solder right there, away from the joint, and a little here, just 2 spots, and then flow that into the shank. Then you put your second half again. Make sure that the cleaned up side is facing inwards. Slide that down tight. Make sure it's parallel. It's a good idea. Take your calipers, measure it. 9.2, 9.1, 9.2, which means not quite square. So I got to make sure that this is 9.1 or pretty darn close to it all the way around. So that's it there. Now, with this on here, I'm going to solder this edge with medium solder just like I did before. However, I can tell that my second side band got a little bit of a gap right here. I should actually make this just a little bit smaller before I solder it on, but I'm not going to solder this on right now anyways. So I put this on, solder it, cut all the extra off. Then, with a large file, you will file this flat, just like this. So I've already soldered both sides. I've cut off with my saw frame some of the extra material. And I'm just watching to make sure that it's all shiny. I want to make sure that solder joint is good before I move on to this stage. What I'm going to be watching for: how good is your solder joint? How even is your solder joints on the sides? I want this polished. You can oxidize the inside, but you cannot hand this in without polishing it. The inside and sides should be polished, please. Obviously, I'm going to sand it, bring it down, yada, 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 keep going. I'm not quite there yet. I can still see a line. I need to sand it more. I want to make sure this is nice and even all the way around here, both sides. Cut this off, do the same thing on the other side. I personally like the inside not to be square. So I'm going to take a rotary file. I'm going to take this inner edge off. It also makes it easier to polish. And then I'm going to sand it with my 220, my 320, or my 240, my 320, my 400, and my 600, whatever sanding levels you usually go to before you polish. So I'm just rounding that edge off just a little bit, makes it more comfortable, makes it more saleable, makes it more like you care. So again, both sides are finished, then I finish, so both sides are soldered, then I finish the edges and prep it for polishing. That's it. Easy peasy.